Hey everybody, Seth here with Living Large and Tiny Living, and today we're going to talk about watts, volts, and amps. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with good old kilowatts from their power and electric bills, so let's discuss that first. A kilowatt is 1,000 watts, and a watt is just a unit of measurement for energy consumption. And like this light bulb here, is 65 watts, meaning it uses 65 watts per hour. So then if it's on for an hour, it's only 65 watts. If it's on for 2 hours, it's 130 watts. But that's what a watt is, but that's not really useful for figuring out how many batteries you need in solar panels systems and how to figure out how many watts are actually in a battery. So let's discuss that. And that comes down to amps and volts, and they're just measurements of electric potential and current, but that's not so important for our discussion. We just need to know how to use them. So amps and volts, you multiply those two together to get watts. I'll give you an example. A 6-volt battery that has 100 amp hours will have a capacity of 600 watts. If you have a 12-volt battery with 100 amp hours, then you have 1,200 watts. And again with the 6-volt battery, but let's say that it increased to 200 amp hours, then we have 1,200 watts with that one as well. So you just multiply amps times volts, and that gives you the number of watts. So that's how you figure out how many watts are in each battery, and then that way you can figure out how many batteries you'll need at a minimum. Now that's not the only thing that you need to know though, unfortunately. I wish it was that simple. There's something called hooking batteries up in series or having them hooked up in parallel. And having them in series means that you're adding the voltages together. Having them in parallel means that you're adding the amp hours together. So with putting them in series, if you put two batteries in series, you're going to add their volts together, but not their amp hours. Why that's necessary is that if you have, let's use the 6-volt batteries with 100 amp hours as an example. Each one of those batteries will produce 600 watts each. So you have two of them, they'll produce 1,200 watts or 1.2 kilowatts. What that means then is that when you add the two batteries together, either hooking them up, let's say we hook them up in series, we can double the voltage, but we can't double the amp hours, because if we have 12 volts at 200 amp hours, we're going to come up with 2,400 watts, and that's not how much the two batteries will produce together. So we have to go 12 volts at 100 amp hours. The opposite works when it's in parallel, because when they're in parallel, you're adding the amps together, but not the volts. So again, the same rule applies. If you have two 6-volt batteries, when you put them into parallel, they're going to stay 6 volts, but the amp hours will go from the 100 to the 200. So then you end up with 1,200 watts at the end, because the watts will stay the same when you add them together. But where that all comes into play at is that you have to put them together in banks of batteries. And why you have to do that is because of the battery inverters. Because the inverter has a set input value of, say, 48 volts. So it requires 48 volts output from the batteries. So you have to put batteries in series in order to get up to that 48 volts. So let's say we have 6-volt batteries. We have to put 8 of those together in series in order to add up 6, 12, 18, 24, and keep going up that way with 6 volts in order to get to the 48 volts. So you end up with 8 batteries. So even if you need 7 batteries, if the inverter requires 48, and you have 6-volt batteries, you're going to need 8 batteries. And then that applies with the 24-volt and 12-volt inverters as well. You just won't need as many batteries. So you only need 4 if it's a 24-volt inverter, or only need 2 if it's a 12-volt inverter. Where putting batteries in parallel comes into play, is that you have a bank of 8 batteries, and that will, say that doesn't power your entire house, but you need 14 or 15 or something like that. You can add another bank of 8 batteries, put that bank in parallel with the first bank, and then you're only increasing the amp hours and not the volts going into the inverter. So then you're able to add on more batteries. But in our case, we'd have to add banks of 8 batteries, so we can't have 14 or 15 batteries. We're going to have to go ahead and bump it up, round it up to 16 batteries. So that's how the voltage and amp hours and watts all affect how many batteries you'll actually need, because you might not be able to get the very minimum number of batteries you'll need. You might have to go above that just because of how batteries work. So that pretty much concludes and sums up everything that you'll need to know to get started into batteries and figuring out all those numbers. Hopefully that helped and isn't too confusing. If it is, you can watch it again or go find another resource that explains it a little differently, and hopefully that'll help some more. But just keep working it out, thinking about it, and eventually you'll get there. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great week, and I'll catch you on the next video.